I need to stop and listen carefully because what I am about to share with you over the next several minutes could quite honestly reshape the way you think about your health for the rest of this year. We are going to talk about Ebola. And before you assume this is a distant problem that affects other continents and other people, I want you to give me your full attention because the World Health Organization has issued an emergency designation at the highest tier available to them, and confirmed transmission has now appeared in districts that were considered low risk just months ago. I am not here to frighten you. I am here to give you the unvarnished science because you have earned the right to be treated like an intelligent adult who can handle the truth. Here is what stopped me cold the first time I sat with the latest figures. A 2024 surveillance review released through the WHO and reinforced by epidemiologists at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine concluded that individuals past the age of 60 face a case fatality rate from Ebola roughly 40% higher than adults in the 25 to 40 age window. 40%. And despite that staggering number, almost none of the public guidance you encounter on television or social media is built specifically with older adults in mind. That is a communication breakdown of historic proportions, and it is precisely the reason this channel exists, to deliver the parts of the conversation that get buried. Now, I want to plant a seed for what is coming later, because near the end of this video, I am going to walk you through the story of a man named Gerald, 67 years old, living quietly in a village in western Uganda, who walked into an isolation ward with a confirmed Ebola infection and walked out alive when his own physicians had privately written him off. What he did, and what the field team noticed about his body that they could not initially explain, contains a lesson that every person over 60 deserves to hear. So stay with me until the closing minutes, because that single case study may rewrite how you see your own body's hidden reserves. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, because I do personally read every single comment on this channel, and I mean that. Drop a note below telling me your age and whether you or someone close to you has ever faced a serious viral illness, whether that was COVID, severe influenza, shingles, or anything in between. Your responses guide everything I produce here, and I take each one seriously. With that said, let us begin properly. To grasp Ebola, you must first understand what it actually is on a biological level, because most people only know the headlines and the fear, never the structure underneath. Ebola belongs to a viral family known as Filoviridae, and when I say that, I want you to form a very particular mental picture. Forget the textbook image of a round, spiky ball. Under an electron microscope, Ebola appears as a thread, a twisting, elongated filament that sometimes coils into a hook, sometimes stretches into a serpentine ribbon, almost alive in its visual menace. In my years studying infectious agents, it remains one of the most haunting structures I have ever encountered. The virus was first isolated in 1976 across two near-simultaneous outbreaks, one along the banks of the Ebola River in what was then Zaire and is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and another in the town of Nzara in southern Sudan. Two countries, two clusters, one terrifying agent. There are 6 recognized species in the genus, and the one that has caused the greatest human catastrophe so far is the species formerly known as Zaire Ebola virus, now simply called Ebola virus. That is the strain responsible for the devastating West African crisis that unfolded between 2014 and 2016, infecting more than 28,000 individuals and claiming over 11,000 lives. To frame that properly, that single epidemic took more lives than every prior Ebola outbreak combined, and it happened despite an international mobilization involving hundreds of agencies and billions of dollars in funding. What makes Ebola so uniquely frightening is not solely its mortality, which ranges from 25 to 90% depending on the strain and access to supportive care. It is the velocity and the precise mechanics of what the virus does once it crosses into a human host. And I will walk you through that shortly in plain, everyday language, because I genuinely believe you deserve to understand what is happening inside the body. Knowledge is not the same as panic. Knowledge is calm power. Let us talk transmission, because this is where misinformation has historically caused real harm. Ebola is not airborne, and I want to repeat that with emphasis because fear distorts memory. Unlike influenza or COVID-19, Ebola does not drift through indoor air on tiny aerosolized droplets. You will not contract Ebola by sharing a hallway, a waiting room, or an elevator with someone who is infected. This is genuinely critical information, and paradoxically, it is part of what makes Ebola hard to contain, because the route it does take is through direct exposure to bodily fluids from a symptomatic person. By bodily fluids, I mean blood, vomit, diarrhea, sweat, saliva, urine, breast milk, and semen. Any of these from an actively ill person can transmit infection if they reach your mucous membranes, meaning your eyes, your nose, your mouth, or if they enter through a cut or abrasion in your skin. That is why the people at greatest risk during outbreaks have consistently been healthcare staff, family caregivers tending to relatives at home, and individuals participating in traditional funeral rituals that involve washing, dressing, or embracing the body of someone who has died. In many African communities where these rites carry profound spiritual and familial meaning, this transmission pathway has been one of the most painful realities to confront, because asking grieving families to abandon the final physical farewell with someone they loved is a wound that goes beyond the medical. Animals are also part of this story. The natural reservoir host, meaning the animal species that carries the virus chronically without dying from it, is widely believed to be fruit bats of the Pteropodidae family. Humans become infected when they handle or consume infected animals, including bats themselves, chimpanzees, gorillas, monkeys, forest antelope, and porcupines. That crossover moment from animal to human is what scientists call a zoonotic spillover. And a 2023 paper out of the University of California, Davis projected that such spillover events are accelerating in frequency as deforestation and human encroachment push settlements deeper into the habitats where reservoir species live. The virus also has some staying power outside the body. On a dry surface at room temperature, it can remain viable for a number of hours, and in moist or liquid environments, substantially longer, which is precisely why protective equipment, gloves, gowns, and face shields are non-negotiable for anyone caring for a confirmed patient. Now I want to take you inside the body of someone who has just been infected, because this is where the science becomes both astonishing and sobering. And I want to be transparent about why this matters most for those of us in our 60s, 70s, and beyond. When Ebola particles enter the human body, illness does not begin instantly. There is an incubation phase, the silent interval between exposure and the first symptom, which can range from 2 to 21 days, with the majority of cases declaring themselves between days 8 and 10. During that entire silent stretch, the person carries no contagion risk to others. That single fact is one of the defining differences between Ebola and airborne pathogens, and it is what makes contact tracing such a workable containment tool when public health systems move quickly. But once symptoms appear, the unraveling can be alarmingly fast. The virus has a favorite first target, the macrophages and dendritic cells of your immune system, which are normally your earliest defenders. Picture your macrophages as the security personnel posted at the lobby of a building. Ebola walks straight up to those guards and, rather than being intercepted, hijacks them, climbs inside them, multiplies within them, and then uses those very cells as transport vehicles to travel through your bloodstream and lymphatic network into every organ system you have. For older adults, this is especially concerning, and here is the reason. Studies funded by the National Institute on Aging have established a phenomenon called immunosenescence, which is essentially the slow weathering of the immune system with age. After roughly age 70, the body's output of naive T cells, the specialized immune cells responsible for recognizing brand new threats, declines by close to 50% compared to a healthy 30-year-old. The practical consequence is that when an unfamiliar pathogen like Ebola enters an older body, the immune response is slower off the line, less targeted, and more prone to tipping into the kind of chaotic inflammatory storm that ultimately damages organs more than the virus itself does. As the virus multiplies through the bloodstream, it next attacks the endothelial cells that line the interior of your blood vessels. This is where Ebola earns its reputation for bleeding. When those vessel linings are damaged, the vessels become porous, plasma escapes into surrounding tissues, blood pressure tumbles, and the clotting system collapses into a contradictory state that doctors call disseminated intravascular coagulation, in which blood clots inappropriately in some regions while failing to clot at all in others. The visible result can include bleeding from the gums, the eyes, the nose, and other surfaces, and that is the image burned into the public imagination. However, and this matters greatly, dramatic external hemorrhage actually occurs in only a minority of patients, somewhere between 30 and 50% of confirmed cases. The far more common presentation in the early days resembles severe influenza, high fever, crushing exhaustion, deep muscle aches, headache, sore throat, followed by vomiting, diarrhea, a rash, and silently failing kidney and liver function underneath. By the time organ failure becomes visible, the virus has often been replicating inside the patient for a full week or longer. I want to share a real-world illustration of everything I have just described. During the 2018 to 2020 outbreak in the North Kivu province of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which became the second largest Ebola outbreak ever recorded with more than 3,400 confirmed cases, clinical teams documented a pattern that the older adult community urgently needs to hear. Patients over 60 showed a noticeably distinct clinical trajectory compared to younger patients. Their fevers were sometimes blunted, masking how sick they actually were. Their first symptoms more often resembled ordinary conditions of later life: dehydration, weakness, stomach upset, which caused critical delays in identification. And once identified, they declined towards severe disease more rapidly. Dr. Liana, who has spent decades engaging with Ebola response work and has written extensively on supportive care strategy, has emphasized publicly that protecting immune function and aggressively maintaining hydration are among the most decisive interventions in older patients, not because they cure the infection directly, but because they buy precious time for the patient's own defenses and for any available medical interventions to take effect. Now I need to update you on the present moment, because this is not history I am describing. As of this recording, the WHO has formally declared a public health emergency of international concern, the highest level of alarm the organization can issue, in response to an active outbreak of the Sudan strain of Ebola confirmed across several countries. The Sudan strain is uniquely worrying because, unlike the Zaire strain, there is currently no approved vaccine for it. Let me say that once more so it lands. There is no approved vaccine for the Sudan strain of Ebola driving today's emergency. A vaccine called Ervebo does exist, developed in the wake of the West African epidemic and used effectively against the Zaire strain in subsequent outbreaks. But the Sudan strain carries a different surface glycoprotein and does not respond to that particular formulation. Several Sudan strain candidate vaccines are now moving through accelerated clinical trials, but none has yet received full regulatory authorization for broad rollout. That is not a scientific failure. It is simply the honest pace of vaccine development. But it does mean that for this specific outbreak, preventive behavior and environmental caution carry even more weight than usual. If you are still here with me, I want to thank you sincerely, because you are the kind of person who treats their health as something worth investing time into. And while we are on that subject, if anything you have heard so far has clarified something important for you, would you take 5 seconds right now to tap the like button and subscribe? I know that sounds small, but it genuinely helps this content reach more of the people who need it most. And consider sending this video to someone you love, a partner, a sibling, an adult child, because what I am about to share next about practical protection applies to every household. Let us talk about what the scientific record actually supports when it comes to protecting yourself, with particular focus on what matters for adults between 60 and 80 plus. The foundational layer of defense is understanding transmission and translating that understanding into daily behavior. Because Ebola moves through direct fluid contact, the single most effective measure for ordinary citizens who are not frontline medical staff is avoiding travel to active outbreak regions, refusing any contact with bushmeat originating from affected areas, and practicing rigorous hygiene if you do find yourself in a region where cases have been confirmed. That means washing your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds at a time, repeatedly throughout the day, which research from Imperial College London has shown can reduce surface to mucous membrane transmission risk by as much as 85% when performed consistently. For older adults, there is another dimension that public health messaging almost never addresses, and it is this: the condition of your baseline immune system before any exposure occurs is one of the strongest predictors of how your body will respond if exposure ever does occur. A 2022 meta-analysis published in Frontiers in Immunology pooled outcomes across 3 separate Ebola outbreaks and concluded that patients with nutritional deficiencies, specifically in zinc, vitamin D, and selenium, experienced mortality rates 28% higher than patients whose nutritional status was adequate. 28%. That is not a rounding error. That is the gap between survival and death for a meaningful share of the patient population. After age 65, the body's capacity to absorb zinc from food declines by approximately 25 to 30% compared to younger adults. Zinc is not merely a folk remedy for the common cold. Zinc is an essential trace mineral that immune cells require in order to replicate, mature, and operate, participating in the activity of more than 300 enzymes throughout the body. Picture zinc as the floor supervisor inside the immune system's factory. Without it, the workers still show up for their shift, but they have no instructions and nothing useful gets built. Foods naturally rich in zinc include oysters, beef, pumpkin seeds, and lentils. And for many older adults, a supplemental form may be appropriate, typically 15 to 25 milligrams daily taken with food to minimize nausea. Always consult your physician before starting any new supplement, particularly if you are managing blood pressure or blood sugar medication. Vitamin D plays an equally essential role. Vitamin D receptors are present on virtually every immune cell in the body, and a study from Queen Mary University of London demonstrated that vitamin D supplementation cut the risk of acute respiratory infection by 42% in individuals who were severely deficient at baseline. While that particular study focused on respiratory infections, the underlying mechanism, vitamin D's role in activating innate immunity, applies broadly to antiviral defense. After age 70, the skin's ability to synthesize vitamin D from sunlight drops by roughly 75% compared to a 20-year-old, and most older adults living in northern latitudes or spending limited time outdoors are chronically insufficient. The optimal serum range is generally considered to be between 40 and 60 nanograms per milliliter, which often requires supplementation in the range of 2,000 to 4,000 international units per day, confirmed through a simple blood test ordered by your physician. And now I want to introduce you properly to Gerald. Gerald is 67 years old and lives in a small farming community outside Mbarara in southwestern Uganda. In the autumn of 2022, during a confirmed Sudan strain outbreak across several Ugandan districts, Gerald was exposed to the virus through close care of a family member who later died from the infection. He was admitted to an isolation ward and tested positive shortly afterward. His medical team, affiliated with a Médecins Sans Frontières field unit, recorded his progression in unusual detail. What they observed defied their initial expectations. Gerald's clinical course unfolded more slowly than predicted. His fever was high, and his fatigue and muscle pain were significant, but he did not develop the catastrophic hemorrhagic complications that several younger patients in adjacent beds were already experiencing. When his case was later written up as part of a small clinical series, the team highlighted several distinguishing features. He had never smoked. He carried no diagnosis of diabetes or hypertension, conditions that, according to a 2021 paper from the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Antwerp, are linked with worse Ebola outcomes because of their corrosive effects on vascular health. He had remained physically active well into his 60s, walking several kilometers each day across his land. And, critically, the nutritional assessment performed on admission revealed that his vitamin D and zinc levels were within healthy reference ranges, which was statistically uncommon within that patient cohort. Gerald survived. He was discharged after 23 days in care. He is not a miracle. He had no access to experimental therapies that other patients lacked. What he had was a body that he had maintained, almost without realizing it, across decades of ordinary choices, and that quiet, accumulated foundation turned out to make a measurable difference when his worst day arrived. There is another part of this conversation I want to address honestly, because I refuse to insult your intelligence with selective storytelling. Some of you are quietly wondering whether you should genuinely worry about Ebola reaching your own community in Europe, North America, or Australia. The truthful answer is that the probability of sustained community transmission in wealthy countries with mature healthcare infrastructure remains low. The tools needed to contain Ebola, contact tracing, isolation capacity, protective equipment, and rapid molecular testing are far more accessible in those settings than in the regions where outbreaks typically establish themselves. However, the risk is not zero, and the 2014 West African epidemic taught us in unmistakable terms that in a hyper-connected world, a single traveler can carry a virus across an ocean before symptoms ever surface. We saw that play out with Thomas Eric Duncan, who flew from Liberia to Dallas, Texas in September of 2014 during his asymptomatic incubation window. He became the first Ebola diagnosis on American soil, and 2 of the nurses who cared for him became infected despite wearing protective gear. Both nurses recovered, and the cluster was contained, but that episode made painfully clear that geographic distance is not the same as biological immunity. That is why the WHO's emergency declaration matters, even if you live thousands of miles from the current epicenter. It triggers international surveillance protocols, releases research funding, and ideally ensures the problem gets addressed at its source before it has time to travel. The best protection for every community on the planet is a fast, well-funded response at the point of origin. Let me now pull everything together, because I want you to walk away from this video not with dread, but with clarity and a sense of what is genuinely within your control. Ebola is a formidable virus with intricate biology. It moves through direct contact with bodily fluids, not through the air. It incubates invisibly for up to 3 weeks before announcing itself. Once symptoms appear, it attacks immune cells, then blood vessels, and finally organ systems. For adults past 60, the combined weight of immunosenescence, accumulated chronic conditions, and quiet nutritional gaps creates a vulnerability profile that demands focused attention. The current outbreak involves the Sudan strain, for which no licensed vaccine yet exists, which makes prevention through knowledge and through personal physiological reserve more important than ever. Here is what you can actually do, starting today. Stay informed through credible sources, the WHO, the CDC, and your national public health authority, and avoid unverified social media claims. Avoid travel into active outbreak districts. Maintain your nutritional foundation, particularly zinc and vitamin D, and verify your levels through a blood test rather than guessing. Manage your chronic conditions diligently, blood pressure, blood sugar, and cardiovascular fitness, because the integrity of your blood vessels and the strength of your immune response are not separate stories, they are chapters of the same story. Wash your hands consistently and properly. And there is one more thing I want to say directly to those of you who are 65, 70, 75 years old and listening to me right now. Your age is not a verdict when it comes to infectious disease. It is a variable, and it is a variable you have far more influence over than the world has told you. The scientific literature is consistent and emphatic that lifestyle factors, nutrition, movement, sleep, and stress regulation continue to shape immune function powerfully across the entire lifespan. It is never too late to begin reinforcing your internal defenses. Gerald was 67 when his body faced the most severe test imaginable, and the years of ordinary, unremarkable choices he had made, the daily walking, the modest diet, the absence of tobacco, became the invisible armor that carried him through. Your independence, your quality of life, your ability to be present at the table with the people who love you, these are worth defending with every legitimate tool available. And the most powerful tool you have is not a pharmaceutical product or a vaccine. It is knowledge applied steadily, without panic, day after day. That is what this channel exists to give you. The scientific references behind everything discussed in this video are linked in the description below, and I encourage you to read them, print them, bring them to your next medical appointment, and share them with the people whose health matters to you. Before I close, I have one question I would love you to answer. In the comments below, tell me whether anything in this video genuinely surprised you, and tell me what health topic you would like me to cover next. I read every comment personally, and your responses shape what I create for this community. If this video gave you something of value today, please tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and send it to someone in your life who needs to hear it. I will see you in the next video, where we will keep doing what we do here, cutting through the noise, following the evidence, and telling you the truth about your health. Take good care of yourself. You are worth the effort.